All right. So good afternoon again, everyone. I'm Dr. Tangela Serls, and I'm an instructor and the undergraduate director in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, where I teach courses such as Literature by Women of Color, Black Feminisms, and Intro to Women's and Gender Studies. I'm delighted to be one of the Humanities Institute's inaugural faculty fellows, and I'm excited to welcome you all to our first seminar. Thank you for attending. In a second, I'm going to give you a formal introduction to today's seminar, but first I want to let you all know how we've organized today's session. So each of us fellows will have approximately 15 minutes to introduce themselves and to introduce an aspect of their work. Each fellow will also share a few of the salient questions they're grappling with and invite attendees to help us think through our inquiries. Alrighty, so I know that this slide goes against all of the best practices for a PowerPoint slide because it's text heavy, but I want you all to be able to follow along with the seminar introduction, and so I'll read it verbatim. Writers work within a paradox that places an emphasis on human values and autonomy, while at the same time expecting Black intellectuals to explicitly assert our humanity by remarking on the race problem. Over the centuries since the advent of racial slavery, Black scholars have taken up this task. Fast forward hundreds of years later, and Black intellectuals are following the example of literary genius Toni Morrison and refusing to explain or even acknowledge the problem as anything other than an artistic one. Acknowledging the problem, that is, Blackness, as an artistic inquiry provides Black scholars with an entry point to imagine a world where Blackness simply is, where Blackness is alive, well, and autonomous. According to Kevin Quashie's Black Aliveness, or Poetics of Being, in a Black world, in whatever manifestations of Black worldness texts create, Blackness, not anti-Blackness, is totality. In such a world, Black being is capacious and right, not more right than, just right as is. Quashie theorizes aliveness by examining the philosophical work of first-person pronouns and imperative and subjunctive verbs in poems of relation and first-person essays. Similar to Quashie, we're beginning our work with a single premise: imagine a Black world, while attempting to move away from centuries-old demands that we teach others about Black humanity. Quashie imagines this work is possible without centering anti-Blackness, but this is a question that we're grappling with. Though he lived and worked during an era where Black intellectuals were explicitly called on to address the race problem, W.E.B. DuBois briefly imagines a Black world in his apocalyptic short story, The Comet. In The Comet, DuBois creates a space where anti-Blackness is not foundational to how people relate to each other. The protagonist is a Black working class man, and through explicit references to his humanity, DuBois seems to suggest that a catastrophe is the only thing that could potentially end the racial bias and discrimination prevalent in the United States. As Black scholars and artists, we are interested in thinking through the symbols and imagery of Black world making as it relates to our respective disciplines. Some of the questions we're asking ourselves are: what does it mean to imagine a world where Blackness is not synonymous with death, where instead it's valued and appreciated for the life it brings to an otherwise drab world? How can Black aliveness help us better understand history, narratives, art, and universal themes such as loss, pain, belonging, grace, and healing? And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to our first fellow, Professor McArthur Freeman.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is McArthur Freeman. I'm an associate professor of animation and digital modeling in the School of Art and Art History. And my work has ranged from paintings and sculpture to digital art and animation. And I'm going to show a few of my works while I'm talking that span a pretty good range of time, but you'll see some pretty distinct changes in approach and I hope that'll add some context to my interest in Blackness, imagination, and storytelling. As an artist, I create images, objects, and experiences that explore Blackness, double consciousness, and the construction of identity. While imagination is important in any creative activity, I will go a bit further to say that fantasy, invention, myth, and the impact of Black and white imaginations are central to my work. My works are meant to be surreal, yet they investigate many of the myths and absurd truths that exist in our real world experiences. From the use of fairy tales, toys, invented wonderland-like worlds, and speculative biology that is interwoven with historical narratives, images from popular culture, and current events, my work becomes a way of exploring and confronting the images that we consume in order to create a dialogue between image, perception, and constructed reality. In these works, perception, experience, and imagination often have more weight than fact because of their influence on our beliefs and their role in establishing the worlds that we construct about our worlds. Those constructed worlds impact the stories that we tell ourselves and others, and we have used them to socialize our kids, create our spaces, write our laws, and perform our identities. For Black people, anti-Black imaginations have led to much pain, oppression, and inequality. Alternately, Black imaginations serve as a site of community, self-expression, resistance, transformation, and escape. I'm particularly interested in the dissidence and displacement involved in the gap between the expectations of the utopian American dream and the reality of racism, mind colonization, confused notions of beauty, and hybridity. For this reason, or for this project, in this project, we're reimagining Blackness. For this project, Reimagining Blackness, we're called to imagine a Black world. And for me, this includes how Black utopias, contemporary Black thought, and narratives created from a Black lens and or for Black audiences can be used to create new narratives or counter narratives that center Blackness, make whiteness visible, and challenge us to recognize racialized systemic structures. Equally important, I'm equally interested in allowing Blackness to just be without having to constantly bear the burden or responsibility of being placed in opposition to whiteness or anti-Blackness. It is through this ability to imagine and ask the question, what if, that we can escape our current constructed realities and find new strategies, access greater awareness, and initiate new ways of seeing and being that we can use to form new ideals, political and social models, strategies, and anti-racist tools for navigating our world. Cast as strange figures, Black people have been the subject of monsterization and exoticization. Black bodies and their behaviors are often contorted and transfigured to justify our humanity and value or to adapt and survive within a racialized world. In our text from Colin Quashie's book, Black Aliveness, he discusses Lucille Clifton's poem Reply, which she wrote in response to Alvin Borges' desire to know whether the Negro sheds tears. And it is a question that underscores the level of otherness and alien semi-humanity of Black people that lives in the white imagination. During this fellowship, I'm creating a series of mini projects in the form of animations and interactive works, which explore Blackness and the challenges of navigating this racialized world. Leveraging storytelling allows or offers a way to engage viewers by placing them in imagined contexts where they are actively involved in imagining new perspectives and allowing alternate perceptions. It is intended as a subversive act that questions the lack of diverse representations of Blackness while valuing the experiences, stories, and voices of Black people. The previous works that I showed were examples of my artworks over time. However, I also want to use these opportunities to discuss other artists and artworks that have a dialogue with our discussions. The first work here is an image by the artist Carrie May Weems entitled Mirror, Mirror. Alluding to the Snow White fairy tale, a Black woman looks in the mirror and asks, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the finest of them all? And I imagine the moments leading up to her question. I imagine that this is a rhetorical question. In her mind, she was looking good. In fact, she was feeling herself. It may not have been a utopia, however, it could have been described as a utopic moment. But the mirror snatched that moment away. If she was beautiful before, she is definitely not beautiful enough now. And to drive the point home, the person in the mirror, is waving her wand and basically saying, you will never be that beautiful, and don't you forget it. Anti-Blackness is ever present, and when the mirror is not symbolic of the outside world structure, which positions Blackness, The mirror represents the internalization of it. That utopic moment is echoed in W.E.B. Du Bois's The Comet as well. After a catastrophic event that involves the passing of a comet, it would appear that a Black man, who is the main character, and a white woman are the survivors, or the only survivors in the world. As the last man on Earth, and after being saved by him, she finally starts to see him as a man. Furthermore, the idea is that they will be the saviors of humanity by repopulating the Earth. And additionally, that they would erase the binary relationship of Blackness and whiteness, escaping anti-Blackness. But that moment is snatched away when white men arrive, denigrate and threaten his life based on his proximity to the white woman who he has just saved. He is catapulted back to his position at the bottom of the social structure. Du Bois's potential utopia here is obviously flawed, but both these narratives illustrate that tension between a utopic moment and their dystopic life. They highlight the inescapability of anti-Blackness, yet when Colin Quashie in his book Black Aliveness called for imagining a Black world, Quashie asserts that this Black world is not one where the racial logics and harming predilections of anti-Blackness are inverted, but one where Blackness is totality, where every human question and possibility is of people who are Black. This reminds me of my undergraduate experiences where a professor once asked me, "When are you going to start creating works about being Black?" I was creating autobiographical works that focused on spirituality and identity. It included images of Black figures submerged in water, wrestling with their skin, and wearing masks at times. I often used myself as a primary figure in my works. I also did portraiture of Black people. In my view, I was creating works about being Black. With much of it being autobiographical, how could it not be about being Black? But that was not what he was looking for. He was interested in a particular type of Black struggle that includes narratives of poverty, suffering, and violence. I understood that he wanted me to show my pain as a Black person in a racist world. His desire to see that pushed me away from that type of critical engagement with racism until later years in graduate school. It made me very aware that we need to have many perspectives and viewpoints of what Blackness is and what Blackness can be, but also that the expressions of Blackness cannot be reduced to only representing our opposition to anti-Blackness. In relation to Black Lives Matter, Quashie also states that as necessary as the Black Lives Matter has proven to be, so efficient and beautiful a truth claim, its necessity disorients me, he says. To hear it said or see it printed as an emblem is existentially disorienting. He says, I want a Black world where the matter of mattering matters indisputably, where Black mattering is beyond expression. As an artist who is interested in world building, I am both intrigued and skeptical of the Black world Quashie describes. Carrie May Weems' work Mirror Mirror resonates with me because it says something pointed about our current experience. I tend to gravitate toward works that are subversive, that offer us tools for understanding our reality. So I use utopic rhetoric or lyrical fantasy to discuss dystopic realities. For instance, my early works use Wonderland to describe the absurdity of police brutality and the effects of anti-Black ideologies. These were never sincere expressions of a utopia. To me, the value of creating a utopia is that they are responses to how to address the problems of the time that they are created within. In response to Quashie's work, my question is, in a time of heightened social, political, and racial unrest, why should we create worlds that do not have the problem of anti-Blackness? How is it useful? Can Blackness escape whiteness and still be Blackness? And if so, how can we articulate Blackness? Wouldn't Blackness in the Black world that Quashie describes also be beyond expression? So those are some of the questions that kind of came out of the text that I'm interested in. And if and I've raised those as questions now for those of you who are interested, that you can either use your raise hand button in Teams, or you can actually also add something to the chat. Okay, so it doesn't look, oh, wait, there was a question. I didn't see the hand up, sorry.
It looked like Jordan Daly.
Yes, hello.
Yes.
I was just thinking about a term that you use in describing DuBois, the Comet. You said that it has a confused. Sorry. That you said it was obviously flawed. And earlier you were talking about in relationship to the way beauty is depicted in painting, that there is a confused notion of beauty. But something I want to think about, via Saidiya Hartman's essay on The End of White Supremacy, in which he's covering this exact same text, is that the idea of utopia in Du Bois is one which is always centered on anti-Blackness. He later regretted writing such analytical works because he realized how deeply invested a white society was in a racist pathology rather than a racist logic. So my kind of question, and what I'm trying to work through in my own work, is this idea of what does it mean to depict Blackness if, under someone like David Marriott's account, Blackness is non-representational. It has no grammar. It can't be motivated to articulate political agency because of its being socially dead. So this is all to say, following someone like Frank Wilderson, this idea that is being preferred here of a world that is free of anti-Blackness is still a world of worlding, in which totalities still matter, in which these structures are still important. Whereas Wilderson says that the very task of Black liberation will be one which destroys completely the very idea of totality and of structure. And so perhaps maybe that's something which can be considered by the aesthetic. Maybe it can't be. Maybe it can only be considered in critical work. But that's what I'm trying to work through, and what you've said is this idea of an Afro-pessimist account and how the aesthetic can still be mobilized if those things are true.
Yeah, so in this case, I think kind of looking back at Quashie's statements, he's really kind of trying to find a way to, basically in response to Afro-pessimism, trying to find a way to talk about Blackness that is not just about Black death, and can we talk about it in a way that that creates this new world where, or at least these are sort of imagined worlds. So in this imagined world that still eliminates anti-Blackness, but but by creating a world that's totally about Blackness. And I think that in some ways, that's problematic in itself, because it also takes away much of the value that we might have in Blackness as well. So, in other words, I don't know if Blackness, I guess this is why my question is, I'm not sure if Blackness can exist in that space.
Yeah, the Afro-pessimist question is an important one here, and obviously one that both you and Jordan are wrestling with. The second question, can Blackness escape whiteness and still be Blackness? It seems to be kind of core here, because right, the reference is always anti-Blackness. If Blackness itself doesn't have a reference in what Afro-pessimism calls the political ontology of this world, then what we are actually referring to is anti-Blackness as the structural foundation of the modern world. And if that is the case, it's somewhat difficult to imagine doing the project that Quashie wants to do. What does it mean that Black social life exceeds the terror that brings Blackness into existence? If in fact the thing that we need in order to articulate what Blackness is a reference to the anti-Blackness itself. It's difficult, but I think actually, and maybe more of a direct response to Jordan's comments, I think that the aesthetic might be more capable of envisioning something that we might call Blackness that is not tethered to anti-Blackness, perhaps much more readily able to do that than critical theory or critical writing can. But I'm going to end all of these comments with an ellipsis. These are just ideas I'm throwing out.
I'm actually hopeful that the aesthetic and that the imagination can lead us to that end, because if not, we're probably doomed. Oh, Jordan's hands up. Yeah, Jordan.
I don't mean the hog of the conversation or anything, so please tell me to stop raising my hand if I get too much. But I'm thinking like very specifically of Calvin Warren and what he says in ontological terror, which is this idea that, again, there is no mobilization of a Black aesthetic because it's always conditioned by, as Fanon puts it, a zone of non-being. It's not representational. There is no grammar which can be manifested. So if that is the case, again, it's in this idea of it's not even to answer like the second question via this Afro-pessimist account. The idea of a Blackness existing outside of whiteness, it seems to be impossible, right? But again, in the way that like Marriott and Fanon seem to push this reading is that, well, I'll put it in the way Fanon puts it. The destiny of the Black man is to become white, right? And he says it's very difficult to say this, but that is the destiny. It's the destiny of the Black man is to become white. So I think the way you square this with what he says later on New Humanism is this idea of that, again, is that this complete shift of totality, which does not desire a new substantiation of totality in which Blackness exists and in which Blackness is, because as Fanon puts it, Blackness is not. Blackness n'est pas, right? It cannot be. It is always the echo of the colonizer. So then the project then, via a kind of decolonial aesthetic or a decolonial project, as Fanon places it, is to move away from all structures of totality, move away from all structures of humanity, move away from all these structures. And perhaps the aesthetic can imagine these things, perhaps. But it seems to me that it'd have to be performed in a way that would be unrecognizable to the aesthetic currently. It would have to deconstruct fundamentally all of the problematic notions of beauty as even an object of the artist's like work, and the structures of the art world entirely before even the work of imagination could then be started. But yeah.
Thank you for those comments, Jordan. Always insightful. For sake of time, because I think that something in my presentation will start to help us think through some of those questions, particularly when we get to Audre Lorde's erotic. So I am going to transition to my portion. Alrighty. So as a womanist literary scholar, I can't reimagine Blackness without also reimagining gender and the feminine divine. Reimagining the feminine divine means amending the purely sexual definition of the erotic. Audre Lorde says the erotic is a resource within each of us that lies in a deeply female and spiritual plane, firmly rooted in the power of our unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. The erotic is the vital force that connects humanity. It inspires us to survive, though we were not meant to, as Lorde reminds us in her poem, A Litany for Survival. So rethinking the erotic in light of Lorde's definition means thinking about the erotic as a source of creativity, as a source that helps us make a way out of no way. And I have the note written that way kind of as a nod to Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Garden, where in it she writes, you know, the reason why we haven't perished, we, our mothers, our grandmothers, our foremothers, in the wilderness is because we remembered who we were. So she says that regardless of all efforts to erase it from our minds, we know exactly who we are. And to me, that knowing part is important. So despite our traumatic past and present, Black women writers use our imagination to assign language to otherwise unexpressed or unrecognized feeling. Language provides fertile grounds for reimagining, particularly because it allows us to create new possibilities outside of repressive systems, which have long been considered the standard. Black women use language to validate vernacular, wisdom, sentiment, wit, and other marginalized knowledges. So one of my long-term research goals is to outline the epistemologies of the erotic. Germane to that goal is my concept of girlfriend epistemology and its relationship to hashtag Black Girl Magic, digital hip hop feminist sensibility, and Black feminist literature and criticism. So if we wish to understand how language and storytelling can be used as tools to help us achieve a more equitable society, we need to study Black women's stories for what they teach us about imagining and realizing liberation and actualization. So at the start of this semester, fall 2021, I attended an in-person event titled Share Your Story, which was hosted by the Advisory Council for the USF Stonewall Suites Living Learning Community. And then the next week, I attended a Sister Circle virtual event on visibility in academia. And that event was hosted by a group named Playful in collaboration with Outcast Theater Collective's Theater of the Oppressed Ensemble. In both spaces, I brought memories and lessons of my maternal and paternal grandmothers. At the Share Your Story event, I mentioned a few of my accolades, but most of my stories centered around my Georgia-born grandmothers who had a profound influence on who I am and am becoming. I discussed how my grandmothers provided me with a wealth of knowledge and wisdom that I still rely on more than a decade after their deaths. I get a sense of my grandmother's presence when I read Alice Walker's work or when I read anything that's in alignment with womanist thought. During the Sister Circle event, participants were asked to introduce ourselves and to note something that we were bringing with us into the space. And then I turned my camera around, when it was my turn, I turned my camera around to show participants a painting once owned by my maternal grandmother that now hangs in my living room. And that's the painting that you see on the screen. It's Tim Ashkar's The Beauty of Color. It's an oil painting, and he describes it as an emotional collage of 8 African-American women bonded by their inner strength and fortitude against the trials of a turbulent history and hopeful in the face of the future. He says its strongest attribute is realized in its reflection of intelligence and beauty inside and out. End quote. So that the painting's most powerful feature is depiction of intelligence and beauty inside and out is important because it affirms our humanity. Furthermore, I'd say that the erotic, as Lord defines it, is what bonds their inner strength and fortitude. The erotic is life-affirming, and it helps us develop relational and crystallized intelligence. It's energy that infuses us with a sense of imagination and aliveness. In Black Aliveness, or Poetics of Being, Kevin Quashie is careful to distinguish aliveness from life. He says, aliveness is an experience one encounters rather than possesses, a relational capacity manifested through the speaking one's sensibilities, her feeling, her intelligence, end quote. So when thinking of Quashie's quote, the scene in W.E.B. Du Bois's The Comet, where Jim's humanity is discussed, comes to mind. Quote, yesterday he thought with bitterness she would scarcely looked at him twice. He would have been dirt beneath her silken feet. Of all the sorts of men she had pictured as coming to rescue her, she had not dreamed of one like him. Not that he wasn't human, but he dwelt in a world so far from hers, so infinitely far, that he seldom even entered her thought, end quote. Black aliveness, as Quashie conceptualizes it, is important because as we see in The Comet, Jim does not come alive to Julia until she has the opportunity to experience him. Unfortunately, that opportunity comes as a result of a catastrophe, that is, a comet expelling toxic gases and seemingly killing everyone in New York City. Ultimately, Julia comes to see Jim's humanity after a brief moment that seems to be indicative of Lord's erotic. Silently, quote, silently, immovably, they saw each other face to face, eye to eye. Their souls lay naked to the night. It was not lust, it was not love, it was some vaster, mightier thing that needed neither touch of body nor thrill of soul. It was a thought divine, splendid, end quote. I believe this vaster, mightier thing described as thought divine is Lord's erotic, which is expansive and resists death in its many iterations. And so questions I am contemplating are, How do we move from our limited understanding of the erotic in the sexual context to an understanding of it as more expansive in the way that Lord imagined it? Is it possible to get to thought divine without encountering catastrophe? If so, how do we do it? And then finally, if we follow Morrison's lead and think of Blackness as an artistic problem, how can we then use it as an opportunity to reimagine Blackness and liberation for Black people, Brown people, and other marginalized groups? And so I'll stop there and invite any comments or questions to anything that I've presented thus far.
Tangela, there's a question for you in the chat. It's from David Rubin. How do you understand the relation between Lord's use of the erotic and uses of anger?
I think that for me, you kind of have to think about both of them. So it's, like the whole intersectional thought of both. And I think that the uses of anger can kind of fuel our attempt to be in touch with the erotic. I think that the way that Lord describes the erotic is, fully feeling like all of our senses and feeling the sensations that come with the senses. And so I think that anger is one of the emotions that is more visceral than some of the other ones. And so I think that when we embrace not only the erotic, but also anger in terms of, not anger just for anger's sake, but, in terms of like, I guess, movement or righteous anger, so to speak, then that will allow us to also be in touch with the erotic. So also allow us to feel deeply, to experience deeply, and then to hopefully use that as kind of like a source for movement. Now, as it relates to Blackness, I think that when we see a lot of like the movements kind of spurring up, I think that that's a good example of, so like for instance, the movement for Black Lives or Say Her Name, that's an example of having that anger and having like a visceral response to the anger, but then that's also kind of fueled by the erotic. So it's no longer just, anger for anger's sake, but to try to reach a means to an end, so to speak. So I guess the question would be, or not to ask a question to your question, David, but how do we, take the anger that can maybe help us to get in touch with the erotic to then reimagine Blackness, which I had not seriously considered how anger factors into it until you asked the question. So now I'm going to go back and kind of think through it a little bit more deeply.
Jordan, your hand just went up.
As a question on how you think more deeply through Lord, I know it's a huge controversy. Well, it is just an academic, digression, I suppose, of how we are to consider Lord's poetry. There is a lot of work done on Lord's wonderful, non-fictional work, and like essays like "The Master's Tools Will Not Dismantle the Master's House" is like a classic for like Black feminist classes. But I'm really interested in how you explore her concepts through the use in her poetry, and if that's ever a place you go to find ways in which these concepts are utilized, or even sort of in that sort of imaginative project we were thinking of before, even begin to theorize or imagine new ways of looking at the world, ways of thinking about the world in which she lives in, or hoping or imagining alternative worlds, if alternative worlds are even possible.
That's a great question, Jordan. And, as a literary scholar, poetry is not one of the things that I immediately go to, but for this project, it's one that I found myself going to more than I would have otherwise, because I think that it's one of those things that allows us to get closer to the aesthetic. So to kind of answer your question, in Quashie's The Intro, there was a poem that I think McArthur referenced earlier, and it talked about, they do. So the name of it was, or the thing that I took from it was they do. And it's this idea of the third person you know, and so for me, it's like if I'm looking at Audre Lorde's poem or any poem by Black woman, I'm looking for, in the same way now that Quashie mentioned, you know, the use of different pronouns. So not only just like the first person pronouns that Quashie is using to kind of get at this idea of Black aliveness, but I'm very much interested in, you know, the use of third person singular pronouns within like poetry by Black women, and what does that mean in terms of trying to speak to Black experiences or to speak to Black aliveness. And let's see, I have it real quick. I'll read it for people if you're interested in that poem, because it was really insightful. And so I'll read this and then I'll stop because I want to make sure that David has enough time. And so the poem is on page 2 of the intro, and it's the reply to Alvin Berquist, and it says, he's wanting to know whether or not the Negro sheds tears. And so Lucille Clifton writes a poem called Reply, and she writes, he do, she do, they live, they love, they try, they tire, they flee, they fight, they bleed, they break, they moan, they mourn, they weep, they die, they do, they do, they do. And so I'm fascinated, like Quashie is, in terms of, you know, Clifton using the third person pronoun they as opposed to first person plural we, when, you know, she would probably consider herself as a part of that group. So the short answer, yes, Jordan, but I haven't done it as deeply as I should, but thank you for putting that on my radar. And so I will stop here because my colleague, Dr. Ponton, has some brilliant things to present to you all as well. So thank y'all for your questions and comments.
Actually, I want to spend a bit more time on your content. So I think I'll have enough time to say some things about my own work in a minute. But if you can go back to the slide where you had the family paint, or the painting that is now a family heirloom.
Okay.
Because the thing that stood out to me, and we've as a cohort, we've been talking about this for a couple of weeks now, but I don't think I ever really paid attention to that line where you say that they're hopeful in the face of the future. There is something there that I think connects deeply with the polemics that McArthur raised. You asked, is it possible to get to thought divine without encountering the catastrophic? And I don't think so. I think that the erotic is catastrophic. And the way that you have talked about it and the way that you have brought Lorde into the conversation, there is this avoidance of the erotic. I think if I'm going to call on a lot of what Jordan's been saying, Calvin Warren would call it being with a capital B. We've developed a politics that doesn't allow people to allow for unfolding and emerging possibilities. We have constricted and constrained what people can be, and part of that involves, I think, a constraining of the erotic. So I think that you have to encounter that catastrophe to get there. And I think that the catastrophe, in another way, is in another turn of phrase, is the way that McArthur described it. It is that dissonance in that space between the utopic moment and the dystopic reality, or perhaps the dystopic empirical. So yeah, I think the more that we talk about this, the more that I see, like in this painting, as I look at it, I don't see the pain or the hurt. I know based on the description that it's tied together by notions of strength that are related to enduring an anti-Black world, but what I see is not that. And I wonder, and now I'm considering more the argument that you and McArthur have made in our own company in the past about the possibilities of envisioning something that we might call beauty, but not within the grammar of this world, beauty in perhaps what Quashie would call the grammar of a Black world. To say that it's impossible, I think would be a reach, but to imagine what could be possible by way of Black art is I don't want to use the word inspiring, but I'll use it for now. But I still have time for my stuff, so I want to open it up to know what other folks think about what you and McArthur have said so far. If people want to raise their hands or put it in the chat. Right, that was my wait time. Um, so I guess I will get started on my part, and hopefully folks will be able to help us think through the questions that you raised, Tangela, because I'm wrestling them with them more than I thought that I would be. But I guess I should introduce myself. I'm David Ponton. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies. I have a lot of the same questions and concerns that McArthur and Tangela have, but I'm a trained historian, and so my questions are much more related to my disciplinary practice. These are the overarching questions that are guiding what I'm going to present to you in terms of content, and then also what I'm going to present in terms of something that I'm thinking through that I would like your help with today. So the overarching questions are, what are the ethical responsibilities of the historian who endeavors to make a thorough and honest account of the ways the past maintains purchase on the present? And I'm borrowing there a lot of Saidiya Hartman's ideas about the afterlives of slavery. So Kevin Quashie claims that anti-Blackness is part of Blackness, but not all of how or what Blackness is. But if the writing of Black history or history in Black is inaugurated and compelled by the persisting problem of anti-Blackness, if the reason why I do what I do is because I am troubled by anti-Blackness, can the historian ever say anything about Blackness that exceeds the anti-Blackness that calls it into being? So those are the questions I want to talk about, provide some context of the work that I'm doing, and then get to this primary source document. So I'm working on my book manuscript, which is about the 20th century process of desegregation, specifically focused on Houston, but with implications, I think, for how we think philosophically about history itself. So there's a man I found in the archive named Johnny Lee Morris. In 1951, as he boarded a bus in downtown Houston, a white man by the name of Frank Morrison reminded him of his place. He was a Negro in Jim Crow's world. It was not uncommon in the segregated South for fights between Black and white people to arise on public conveyances like buses, but on this cool autumn day, Morris found himself under physical assault from Morrison and the bus driver, Peter Novak. Morris pulled a knife and fatally stabbed Novak. Arrested 3 days later on an unrelated charge of being married to a white woman, Morris found himself in the throes of the criminal legal system, where all empowered parties, from the judge's bench to the prosecutorial team to the jury, were all white and all male. Despite the fundraising efforts of Black Houstonians and a very skilled defense team, Morris was found guilty of murder. However, the jury recommended a life sentence rather than the death penalty. And this was a rare outcome for a homicide case involving a Black perpetrator and a white victim. It indicated to Black Houstonians that they had successfully convinced the jury of Morris's right to self-defense, even if that jury didn't affirm such a right because they convicted him nonetheless. Still, Black Houstonians, such as the head of the NAACP, considered this a victory and a fair trial. Now, the idea that the disposition in Morris's case could be a win troubles me as a historian. How do I represent that? What could be redeemable about a world wherein a Black person's claim to self-defense is inadmissible and their life and death is determined by the capriciousness of a group of white people? What must the ethics of a world be such that life imprisonment for an act of self-defense is considered mercy? Especially in the US, where self-defense is legally encoded to justify a mortal wound to someone else. More than that, why is the archive abundant with what other folks thought about Morris, but almost completely devoid of his voice? How does that condition limit my ability as a historian to understand Morris's gasp for breath from the constricting tendrils of Jim Crow? How does the archive already shape the narrative such that the ethics of the world that corporealize its fantasies about the Negro in the form of Morris remain stubbornly intact? My challenge with this cohort and with the fellowship this year is to push against this kind of archival problem and to develop a method that approximates what I'm calling an anti-disciplinary approach to history by way of Black pessimism, to envision an anti-ethical world through a manipulation of form, one that chronicles Morris's fate and fights its way through the abyss of Black suffering to imagine a post-apocalyptic world. A world not just without all-white juries and all-white judicial seats, but perhaps a world without juries and judges at all. Morris's travails are emblematic of Derek Bell's claim that racism is permanent in American society. So I wonder, how can Morris's life teach us about the vacuity of the courts, the political nature of the law, the impermissibility of Black plenitude, and the inadmissibility of Black people's claims to self-defense? I wonder, indeed, how a historian can refuse the discipline's mandates to write the past as the past, to acknowledge the afterlives of slavery, and to see the purchase that Black suffering has on the whole project of thought itself. In short, how to write toward the end of the world in order to find some place or no place from which to imagine a new one. So with these overarching concerns in mind, I'm hoping you might be able to help me think through a primary source I've been spending significant time with over the past week and a half. I'm revising the final chapter in my manuscript, which used to be essentially about the police attack at Texas Southern University in 1967. A constant refrain in urban historiography is that Houston is an anomaly, that among Southern cities, it stands out as having a peaceful desegregation process. And then the TSU attack is treated as an anomaly within that anomaly. But with my eyes trained by Afro-pessimist thought, I've become more attuned to what Tryon P. Woods calls prior tortures. Black folks in Houston experienced quotidian terror, and this document is the case of Lucille Davis. She explains in 1966 that she lived in fear of white terrorism, and she describes spectacular forms of violence: gasoline being poured on her lawn, bricks being thrown through her window, gunfire outside her front door. But this terror was not just spectacular, much of it was intimate and private and located at the constitution of being itself. I imagine, right, and as a historian, this is not disciplinary practice, but I imagine she must have experienced physiological change due to the lack of sleep and the constant stress and distress. Sorry if you're hearing helicopters in my background. So Kevin Quashie writes that Black social life is the register of Black experience that is not reducible to the terror that calls it into existence, but is the rich remainder. But is this a conclusion I can rock with given the content of the archive? Is it ethical for me to try to find some residue or to otherwise invent a residue called Black aliveness if the thing that makes it Black, if the thing that made Lucille Davis Black was not her identity or her phenotype, but rather the kinds of terror and reckonings that troubled her? So I'm also asking, right, the questions here at the bottom: is history as a discipline necessary for attending to the moral issues surrounding Black existence? Is it ill-equipped to do the work that Quashie wants? And in that sense, could history be conceived as anti-Black if it is incapable of imagining Black as alive? Or is Quashie's Black aliveness anti-Black if it proposes the Black world that somehow escapes or occludes or ignores the historical construction of Blackness through the violence of anti-Black terror? So those are the questions I want to put on the table, the metaphorical table. But I invite any engagement with the content that I presented, or even backwards engagement with a lot of what Tangela and McArthur introduced to us today. So I will be silent for a second. There's a comment in the chat. I'm going to read that, and I guess I'm also going to turn it over to Jordan, whose hand is up. So Jordan, you can go ahead first.
Okay. No, because like everything you're saying here is like are exactly the same things that I'm trying to get at in my work. But what the conclusion I've reached concerning the archive is that the archive is always a space that is claiming the material for itself and is a defense of its claim, right? Because what the archive is the dispossession of Black objects, right? Is that these objects are not being contextualized. They're existing usually in institutions apart from Black communities, right? So like even on just a structural level of being apart from the Black community and what a Black community archive could create, there's already a dispossession, right? So the conclusion that I reach is something very similar to what Jared Sexton says in his essay, The Avant-Garde of White Supremacy, right? Is that the problem has always been in that our approach to white supremacy has been able to conceptualize it. But what they say with Steve Marriott and Marneau and Jared Sexton are saying in that essay is that the reason it hasn't been able to conceptualize is because it's surface deep. The water is empty. It's wallow, right? It's that, and that I think explains why the NAACP sees a life sentence as a relief because the expectation is always death. That's the key, right? Is that when we expect death, when we cannot imagine anything better than that, it destroys all possibility of all other worlds. So in my own work, I've been trying to see the archive not as an escape from anti-Blackness, but as codifying and finding some of its rules and ways in which we can then analyze and critique the ways in which these rules constantly disseminate themselves in different mediums. Now, that work can be seen as a positive work. That work is important, but it's not a work that can run away. Like, that's what Wilderson calls, staying in the hold. History is the hold. And so that's why that work is important, but it's not a work that's going to help us give us the capacities to then imagine a better one. It helps us destroy this one.
I follow all of that, and I probably don't disagree. There's a part of me that hesitates, and that is the part of me that thinks if it is in fact, and by it I mean history, and by history I don't mean the past itself, but the process and practice of making arguments about what the past means and its relationship to the present and to the historian. If that does have the capacity for exposing the mechanisms and techniques by which this world perpetuates anti-Blackness, I don't know that it necessarily follows that it's also not a domain in which we can imagine alternative ways of being. But, and this is where, this is what I'm wrestling with, is the disciplines that currently define what is history are probably incapable of doing the work of imagining something else. And that's kind of why I find the kind of work that McArthur and Tangela do with the art and with art and the erotic as compelling, because it might provide historians with alternative methods or skills or ways of thinking that are not currently acceptable within the discipline. That was a question mark at the end. Tangela, there's a comment in the chat for you from Cynthia Patterson. If you wanna take a look at that.
Sure, I was gonna respond in chat, but I can just respond real briefly right now. So the short part of it is I don't think that we can get to thought divine within the realm of Christian theology. I think that the erotic, it kind of breaks out of all kind of institutionalized religions, and it's kind of like the spirit, capital S, that binds people together. I think that there are maybe useful parts of Christian theology that could be incorporated with an analysis of thought divine or the erotic, but not in its totality. And with the part about other religions, can it happen in other religions such as Islam, African religions, or outside religions completely? I think so. I think absolutely. And I'll also type in the chat.
There was a comment for me also from, actually, I don't know if Cynthia, if you want to respond to what Tangela said before. Before I say anything.
I think I did. I was just trying to recoup her notion of being interested in theology in what her current work, the trajectory of her current work.
I'm still very much interested in theology, and I think it's just like, growing up Black Southern Baptist, it won't let me go. And thinking about my grandmothers too, both of them are very religious women, but seeing what parts of it is useful and what parts aren't, I think is going to be a part of the work too. So yeah, but thank you for that question.
I think you could be a Unitarian. That's what I'm thinking.
I should look into that.
Cynthia, you had another comment. I'm going to read it for everyone. I'm a cultural historian by doctoral training, and I work on Black women's social movements during the progressive era, particularly as expressed in the women's club records and religious periodicals. I'm wondering to what extent you consult Black periodicals to compare their coverage of, say, Morris's case to that found in white print culture. And a good deal of what I do in that case is comparing the ways that the white press in the city and the Black press covered the case. And how do I say this without rewriting my dissertation with words right now? The place where the white press and the Black press come to agree, so they disagree on a lot of the facts surrounding the case. They disagree on whether or not Morris has a right to self-defense. The white press, even before they knew that Morris was involved, was already spreading rumors about who this person could have been, rumors that were completely unfounded. But at the end, they all agree that Houston did something special by allowing this Black, and I'm using the word allow on purpose, by allowing this Black person to live out the rest of their life in prison. That Houston showed what was possible by way of the rule of law, that there was procedural justice, that fairness was possible, right? Using the metaphysical instrument that is the law to promote and forward the idea that there was some promise in American democracy. And so in that way, the fact that they meet at that location indicates to me that a shared kind of capture of thought by this notion of equality under the law. And that troubles my entire project, notions of Black thought as being somehow severable from the anti-Blackness that troubles it. So that's my comment in regard to that.
Thanks. I got to run to another meeting, but I really enjoyed all the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Comment.
There was one more comment in the chat, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Tangela. It was from Michelle Hughes Miller. I'm wondering about this methodologically. Adele Clark's situational analysis argues that the identification of the invisible in data and history, I assume, is even more powerful in our analyses than that which is recorded. I wonder if the invisible is the space for imagining Black as alive. I think so, Dr. Miller, but I also have the problem with the invisible for me as a historian is that my colleagues expect empiricism, and that is why I'm trying to figure out how to develop a method that is both faithful to the profession, but that is also ethically accountable to the folks who are made invisible by the structures of the profession, in this case, the archive. So I'm still working that through, kind of the point of why I'm here. Tangela, you can have it.
No, you have one more question.
All right, let me see. This is from David Rubin. If the archive is structurally anti-Black, is there a way of reading the archive against the grain, as it were, to make possible what Hartman calls dreams for existing otherwise? My experience so far is not really. I engage a lot with Saidiya Hartman. I am practicing critical fabulation. I'm practicing David Kanzijan's critical speculation. And I don't think, and part of her argument with critical speculation as a method is that we should refrain from trying to fill in gaps. We should refrain from thinking that reading against the archival grain necessarily does something towards this purpose of dreaming for existing otherwise. In her most recent book, she departs very much from the archive in ways that she doesn't in Scenes of Subjection or Lose Your Mother. And I think that's because there is as you mentioned, a structural limitation there. So my quick answer is, I don't think so.
All righty. So we're right at time, and I do want to be respectful of you all's time on this Friday afternoon. So I want to just say thank you again to everyone for coming to our first seminar, and please be on the lookout for the details for the next one. Thank y'all.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.